a third of which lies below sea level. A country where the largest airport, handling tens of millions of passengers a year, sits on the bottom of a former lake, 4 meters below the ocean's surface, and where the lowest point descends almost 7 meters below wave level. By all the laws of nature, this country should be a seabed, and if all the pumps were turned off one day, it would become one, with the waters beginning to return within days. And yet, on this impossible terrain, nearly 18 million people live and thrive. Cities stand tall, fields flourish, and this country ranks among the richest on the planet. This is the Netherlands, a nation that has been waging war with the sea for 1,000 years. And, most astonishingly, it's winning so far. Today we'll tell you how the Dutch literally built their country with their own hands, explore the world's most sophisticated flood protection system, recall the night the sea finally broke through and claimed thousands of lives, debunk the famous myth of the boy who plugged the dam with his finger, and uncover the secret behind why, in recent years, the Dutch have suddenly begun to surrender their hard-won land to the sea. There's an old saying in Europe, God created the world, and the Dutch created the Netherlands. And it's only half a joke. To understand it, let's look at what this land originally was. The Netherlands, which translates as lowlands, is a gigantic delta, the place where several major European rivers, including the Rhine, flow into the North Sea. For millennia, the rivers carried silt and sand here, and thick layers of peat accumulated on the marshy plains. The result was a flat, damp, spongy land, barely emerging from the water, a realm of swamps, channels, and tides, regularly flooded by the sea. The Romans, having reached these lands, wrote of the local inhabitants with amazement and pity, as if they were a wretched people living on pitiful mounds in the middle of the water, collecting firewood from whatever the tide washed up. These very mounds, artificial residential hills called terps, were the first ingenious invention of the locals. Unable to stop the floods, people simply raised their homes and villages above the water, building the mounds by hand, basket by basket. Hundreds of these ancient mounds remain to this day, and many still house churches and farms. Thus, 2,000 years ago began this people's great conflict with the sea. About 1,000 years ago, the Dutch switched from defense to offense. Instead of hiding in the hills, they began enclosing entire tracts of land with ramparts, thus giving birth to the first dikes. And with them came something perhaps even more important, a special form of self-government. The fact is that a dike protects everyone who lives behind it, and a breach on the property of one careless owner drowns his hard-working neighbors as well. Therefore, already in the Middle Ages, residents began to unite in so-called water councils, elected bodies that monitored the dikes, collected taxes for their maintenance, and could compel anyone, from peasants to noblemen, to fulfill their duties of protection against flooding. These water councils exist to this day and are considered the oldest democratic institutions in the Netherlands, predating the Dutch state itself. The head of such a council is a man with a title that sounds like something out of a medieval romance, the Count of the Dikes. Elections to these water councils are still held in the country just like parliamentary elections. The Dutch seriously vote for those who will manage their water dikes. For centuries, a special duty existed. In the event of a threat, every resident was obligated to appear to defend the dike, and this dike army of local volunteers formally exists to this day. During major storms, caretakers patrol the embankments, looking for leaks, just as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago. Many historians even believe that the famous Dutch traits, the ability to negotiate, the habit of compromise, and teamwork forged precisely by water. In the face of flood, class distinctions are meaningless. Dike either stands or it does. The sea, oddly enough, became the co-author of the national character. But keeping the water out was only half the battle. It was also necessary to remove the water that accumulated inside, rain, river floods, and seeping moisture. And here comes the main symbol of the Netherlands, the windmill. We're used to thinking of mills as grinding grain, but in Holland, a huge number of them did something completely different. They pumped water. A windmill turned a wheel, or propeller, which lifted water from a low-lying area and poured it over a dam into a canal, from where it flowed to the sea. This is how the invention that became the cornerstone of the entire country, the polder, worked. A polder is a plot of land reclaimed from the water, surrounded by a dam, drained by canals and pumps, and governed by a simple but merciless rule: water must be pumped, always, forever, without days off or holidays. Stop the pumps, and the land will return to its original state. Beginning in the 16th century, the Dutch began draining entire lakes with polders. Dozens of mills lined up in chains, lifting the water step by step, and in place of the water's surface, fields and villages emerged. This is how the vast Haarlemmermeer Lake was drained, at the bottom of which Schiphol Airport now stands. Its name, incidentally, preserves the memory of the past, as ships once sank here. You can still see Holland's ancient water engine in action today. In the town of Kinderdijk, a legendary line of 19th-18th century mills stands along canals. This scene is included in the World Heritage List and has become one of the most recognizable landscapes on the planet. However, windmills no longer do the bulk of the work. Modern pumping stations operate around the clock across the country. Thousands of them, from tiny automatic ones to giants capable of pumping entire rivers, work around the clock, and together they discharge staggering volumes of water from the country into the sea every day. Holland is essentially a giant bathtub from which water is constantly being bailing out. However, this enormous construction project does have a treacherous downside. Drained peat dries out, shrinks, and sinks. The land sinks ever lower, requiring ever more intensive pumping. It's a vicious cycle. The more the Dutch drain their country, the lower it sinks, and the more necessary dams and pumps become. There's no escape from this trap. There's only endless work. Incidentally, since the country lives in constant contact with sea level, centuries ago the Dutch adopted a standard, the so-called Amsterdam Zero, a mark of average water level from which all heights and depths in the country are measured. This mark proved so convenient that, over time, many European countries adopted it as a reference point for altitude, and when someone in Germany or Austria writes down their altitude, they're unknowingly measuring it from the water level in Amsterdam. The small, marshy country literally set the continent's coordinate system. For centuries, the system had weathered the storm, but the sea held a terrifying reminder of who was truly in charge. On the night of February 1st, 1953, a fierce storm and a high spring tide converged on the North Sea. Hurricane-force winds drove water toward the shore, sea levels rose several meters above normal, and the old dikes, weakened by war and decades of underinvestment, gave way. In the darkness, amid the howling storm, water breached dozens of defenses and poured into the sleeping villages of the southwestern provinces. People awoke to the sound of icy water pouring into their bedrooms. Families scrambled to attics and rooftops, and houses, old brick houses, not designed to withstand the waves, collapsed under the force, taking entire families with them. Telephone lines were cut, radios were down overnight, and many communities struggled with the elements in complete isolation, unaware that the disaster had engulfed half the country. Communication with the isolated areas in the first hours depended largely on amateur radio enthusiasts who sat for days at a time near their homemade transmitters, relaying calls for help. Rescuing people from rooftops was done by anyone who could: fishermen in boats, soldiers in amphibious vehicles, helicopters, of which the country had only a few at the time, and aid pouring in from around the world. That night and in the following days, more than 1,800 people died. Tens of thousands of animals died. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes, and vast tracts of land were flooded. For a small country, it was a shock comparable to war. That night also told a story worthy of a film in its own right, and, unlike the tale of the boy with the thumb, it was completely real. When water burst through a dam protecting the densely populated heart of the country, sending a flood threatening to inundate cities with millions of residents, the mayor of one town persuaded a local skipper to take a desperate step: plug the breach with his own vessel. The captain steered his old barge straight into the roaring breach, and the vessel's hull, lodged in the hole, blocked the flood, giving people time to reinforce the dam with sandbags. One man on one barge essentially saved the country's most populated region from flooding. Just weeks after the tragedy, a government commission was created to deliver a historic verdict. Such a thing must never happen again, no matter the cost. Thus was born the most ambitious engineering project in the history of the country, and perhaps of all of Europe, the Delta Plan. The Delta Plan is a system of gigantic structures damming the bayous and river mouths in the southwest of the country, dozens of kilometers of new levees, locks, barriers, and dikes that took decades to build. The American Society of Engineers would later list these structures as one of the 7 wonders of the modern world, and for good reason. There are 2 crown jewels. The first is the Oosterschelde Barrier, a 9-kilometer structure made of colossal concrete piers with steel shields suspended between them. Initially, the plan was to simply seal the bay with a dam, as had been done with other bayous. But fishermen and the then-fledgling environmental movement objected, arguing that a permanent dam would have destroyed the bay's unique tidal ecosystem, its renowned oysters, mussels, and bird colonies. The dispute divided the country, and ultimately a compromise was born, costing several times more than a simple dam, a movable barrier. During normal times, the barriers are raised, allowing the sea to flow freely, preserving the bay's unique natural environment with its oysters and seals. But when a storm threatens, the barriers are lowered, blocking the water's passage. The Dutch incurred a significant cost increase precisely to avoid killing marine life with a solid dam. And this is perhaps the first time in history that an engineering structure of such scale has been redesigned for environmental reasons. The second jewel is the Maaslandkering Barrier, which protects the port of Rotterdam, the largest in Europe. A conventional dam is insufficient to block the shipping channel through which these ocean giants navigate. So the engineers created something out of science fiction. 2 gigantic floating gates, each the size of the Eiffel Tower on its side, which normally rest on docks on the shore. When a computer system constantly monitoring the sea and weather predicts a dangerous rise in water, the gates automatically move toward each other, close across the canal, fill with water, and sink to the bottom, sealing Rotterdam from the sea. Each such operation halts operations at the continent's largest port and costs the economy a fortune. Therefore, the trigger threshold was set high, and throughout its history, the barrier has only been closed in combat a handful of times. Every autumn, it is ceremoniously closed during exercises, and crowds of spectators flock to watch this ballet of steel giants. The decision to close is made automatically, without human intervention, because the cost of error is too high, and the temptation to hope for the best is all too human. Along with concrete and steel, Plan Delta also gave the world a new security philosophy. The Dutch were the first in the world to enshrine in law the probability of their defenses failing. In the most populated areas, dams are designed to withstand a storm that occurs on average once every 10,000 years. Consider that figure. The last time something like this happened was before humanity invented writing. No other country in the world imposes such demands on its defenses. By comparison, in many countries, dams are designed to withstand events that recur once every 100 or 200 years. Every dam in the country is registered, regularly inspected, and reinforced at the slightest non-compliance. This is the Dutch response to the sea. Not heroism on the last night, but tedious, meticulous, and endless preventative maintenance. But even before the Delta Plan, the Dutch had carried out an operation that could, without exaggeration, be called a reimagining of geography. In the north of the country, the Zuiderzee, a deep-sea inlet, jutted deep into the land, threatening the central provinces with floods for centuries. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the Dutch solved the problem radically. They simply closed off the sea. They built the Afsluitdijk, a 32-kilometer-long dam across the inlet, along which a motorway now runs, and the salty inlet, cut off from the ocean, gradually transformed into the freshwater lake IJsselmeer. This triumph had its price, paid not by engineers, but by fishermen. For centuries, villages had lived around the Zuiderzee, subsisting on the sea, herring, and eel, and the closure of the inlet deprived them of their livelihoods overnight. An entire culture, with its own costumes, boats, and way of life, vanished into history. The former island of Urk, a proud fishing community in the middle of the sea, ceased to be an island altogether after the surrounding polders were drained, finding itself in the middle of nowhere. Today, it is perhaps the only fishing port in the world, surrounded by fields on all sides. Its residents, however, did not give up, and to this day fish through the locks into the North Sea. Then, something incredible happened. Polders began to be built on the bottom of the former sea, creating new land. Thus, the entire province of Flevoland emerged from the water, the largest man-made island on the planet, home today to hundreds of thousands of people. Its capital stands on the site where a warship sank in the 17th century, the remains of which were discovered during the draining of the future city. And this isn't an isolated incident. While draining the bed of the former bay, archaeologists have discovered the remains of hundreds of ships from all eras, from medieval fishing boats to Golden Age merchant sailing ships. Flevoland is known as the world's largest land-based ship graveyard, and local farmers sometimes stumble upon an ancient ship oak tree right in the middle of a wheat field. People here literally walk on the seabed, ride bicycles across it, and grow the famous tulips there. If you ever see a photograph of the endless tulip fields of Holland, there's a good chance these flowers are growing on soil that, just 100 years ago, was a seabed teeming with fish and ships. Now it's time to examine a famous myth, a staple of any story about Holland. The story of a little boy who noticed a leak in a dam, plugged the hole with his finger, and stood there all night, saving the country. This story is considered an ancient Dutch legend, yet the Dutch themselves hadn't even heard of it for centuries. The fact is, the boy with the finger was invented by an American writer in the 19th century. The episode from her children's novel about Hans Brinker spread around the world, and generations of American and European school children grew up believing it to be genuine Dutch folklore. Tourists visiting the Netherlands persistently asked where the statue of the heroic boy was, and the Dutch, a practical people, eventually gave in and erected several statues specifically for their guests. It was a rare case of a myth invented overseas materializing in bronze in a country to which it had no connection. The irony is also that, from an engineering perspective, history is meaningless. If a dam leaks, a finger won't save it. The water, having found a way, erodes the hole with every passing minute. The real heroes of the Dutch struggle against the sea are not fairy tale boys, but thousands of anonymous builders, dam keepers, and engineers who have been doing their daily work for centuries. Incidentally, let's also dispel another popular myth, that Amsterdam rests on water like Venice. Amsterdam rests on stilts. Millions of wooden, and now concrete pillars are driven through soft soil to a firm sand layer, and these supports support the entire old city, including the Royal Palace, under which there are more than 13,000 of them, while the central station is built on artificial islands made of thousands of stilts. The Dutch even have a joke that Amsterdam was built on herringbones, meaning that the city's wealth, which paid for all those piles and canals, was acquired through the fish trade. And one more clarification for accuracy. Contrary to popular belief, not all, or even half of the country lies below sea level. About a third of the territory lies below. Yet without dams and pumps, almost 2/3 of the country, where the majority of the population lives and the lion's share of the economy is generated, would be subject to regular flooding. So the dependence on defense is total, even if the formal figures are more modest than the myth. It would seem that history had reached a happy ending. The country was strengthened, marvels of engineering stood guard, and life and happiness awaited. But in recent decades, the Dutch have made a turn no one expected. They began returning land to the water. It sounds like capitulation, but it's a cold calculation. Climate change is raising sea levels and making storms and river floods more severe, and engineers realized that endlessly building up dams is impossible. The higher the wall, the more dire the consequences of its breach. A new philosophy was born, not to fight with water, but to negotiate with it. Under a program dubbed Room for the River, dams have been moved inland in dozens of places, giving the rivers floodplains so that during floods, the water has somewhere to spill without threatening cities. To achieve this, the state had to buy out farms and relocate families who had lived on their plots for centuries. These were difficult, painful decisions, but the logic is simple. It's better to sacrifice a field up front than a city later. Some polders, so painstakingly won by our ancestors, were deliberately flooded, turning them into natural reservoirs. In Rotterdam, they're building squares and parks that turn into storage pools during rainstorms. And entire neighborhoods of floating houses are already floating on the water, impervious to any rising waters. They simply float with it. These houses are anchored to piles, sliding up and down like a ring on a finger. All utilities are connected to them, and from the outside, the neighborhood is indistinguishable from a normal one, except that the residents have their own dock instead of a front garden. Architects seriously speculate that this is exactly what the coastal city of the future could look like worldwide. There's a truly elegant solution. Instead of constantly replenishing eroding beaches, engineers have built a giant artificial sand peninsula off the coast and let the currents drag it along the shore, replenishing the beaches for years without any machinery. This project is called a sand motor. Holland, which battled the sea for 1,000 years, is learning to harness its power to its advantage, and this is perhaps the greatest wisdom gleaned from 10 centuries of war. Today, Dutch expertise has become a hot commodity. Dutch engineers design flood defenses for New Orleans and New York, consult for Bangladesh and Vietnam, Jakarta and Venice. And whenever a coastal city around the world considers its future with rising seas, the first place it calls is the Netherlands. The Dutch themselves are looking ahead, without panic but soberly. Government programs calculate the country's defenses for a century to come, with reserves for the worst-case sea rise scenarios. Every year, the country invests in its water security, sums that others consider wasteful. But for the Dutch, insurance, since a large part of their economy is protected by levies. But what if all the pumps really do stop one day? Engineers have calculated this too. Lowlands will begin to flood in a matter of days, and in a few years, the country's map will roll back 1,000 years, and the sea will reclaim everything it has borrowed. In this sense, the Netherlands is a bicycle country. It exists as long as the pedals turn. But for 1,000 years, there's never been a desire to stop here. This story is the best proof that perseverance, intelligence, and the ability to negotiate with neighbors and nature itself can transform a hopeless swamp into one of the best places to live on Earth. If you found this story interesting, please like and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to come about how humans are changing the planet. Until next time.